Welcome back again. Hope you've been enjoying the problem. Have you managed to solve it? This is a very interesting, very unique problem. Every move is pretty much forced. And as you can see, black at all costs is going to try to draw this. And in order to do so, he must take the pawn, even though he's giving up his rook. In order to do this, he must get in back of the pawn. White cannot allow this to happen. Therefore, the only move in this position, since the king can't move into this rank, and if he moves to any of these squares, black could come behind the pawn and then take it, he must push it. Now black, not being able to get behind the pawn, not being able to come down and stop it from queening, otherwise he'd be taken, must check. Now, if white comes here, black can come here and pin the pawn, and on the next move take it, so it's a draw. If white moves away, any of these squares, black can come behind the pawn, and on the next move take it. So he has a choice between these two squares. If he moves to this black square, black can come down to the bottom of the board, and if white queens the pawn, black can come here and check and win the queen. Even if he doesn't queen the pawn, the next move, black can still come here and win the pawn. So on the check, white must come here. And for the same reasoning, black has no other move other than to keep checking. And for the same reasoning again, white cannot come into this square or move away because black can eventually get to that pawn. So he moves here. Black, again, must keep checking. Keep checking. Now, white can move into here because the board isn't big enough for black to come down and be able to check and win the pawn. Well, it doesn't look very good for black. He can't come down and stop the queen. He can't go around behind. He can't stop that pawn. But he has one chance to play here. Do you see this now? If white queens, black checks, and forced is queen takes rook, and black is stalemated. The king can't move, and that would be a draw. Looks bad, huh? Maybe white can't win it, you'd think for a second. But what if he takes a rook? This is the solution. Now white is threatening to mate black. See, the king there's no squares to move to. If this white rook can come over here and check, it's mate. Moving the king doesn't do any good. Still mate. The only move that stops mate is to move the rook here. And now, the last and most key move. King to knight 3. A double threat. Attacking the rook and at the same time threatening mate. And there is no way to meet both threats, and any reasonable player would resign. To continue this week in getting it all together, we're going to try to show you how to get a hold of an idea, a theme in the game of chess, and carry it through to the end successfully in an attempt to win. To keep the total aspect of the board in mind rather than just concentrating on one side or the other side or one part of it. To think in terms of the whole board and the whole concept of what the game means and what it's progressing to. We'll just go over here and we're now going to look at the theme behind the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. You've seen this before. pawn to king 4, pawn to king 4, knight to king bishop 3, knight to queen bishop 3, bishop to knight 5, pawn to queen rook 3. And the exchange variation is where white gives up the bishop for the knight by playing bishop takes knight. Black, of course, plays queen pawn takes bishop, because then if white decides to take this pawn, black may play queen to queen 5, win back the pawn, and stop white from castling, as we've already seen. The reason why white gives up the bishop, which is slightly more valuable than the knight in this position, is to disrupt black's pawn structure. The eventual aim here will be to get into an endgame where white has the more favorable pawn structure, as you'll see. And why? White castles. One of the main and best variations for black is to play pawn to bishop 3. Pawn to queen 4 for white. Bishop to knight 5 for black. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Excuse me there. Pawn takes pawn. And now, the only good move in the position is to play rook to queen 3. Why? So that if bishop takes knight, rook can take back, and white does not have to disrupt his pawn structure. And this does happen. Bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop. Now, knight to bishop 3, attacking the pawn. Knight to bishop 3, defending the pawn. Bishop to knight 5, attacking the piece which is defending the pawn. But white sees a little into the position and decides that that's all right, and plays bishop to knight 5 himself. Bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, again. Knight takes pawn. Rook to king 3, losing a piece. Knight takes bishop, but he gets it back. Rook takes pawn, check. King to bishop 2. Rook takes knight. Now it all becomes clear. White has 3 pawns to 2 pawns majority on the king side. And black has 4 pawns to 3 pawns majority on the queen side. Which, if these pawns were in better position, this could even be a disadvantage for white, because the king is farther away from the defense of the side where he has the least pawns against the majority. But with these pawns doubled like this, these 3 can hold these 4, whereas these 2 cannot hold these 3. White can force a passed pawn. That means a pawn that is gone. But it's a very complicated position, and it is theoretically a win, but white has to exchange off the rooks to his advantage in order to achieve the win, and this becomes very difficult. But with these rooks over the board, with the use of proper tempos and timing, white could win this position. So you see, when you start the game, any game that you're playing, you must try to have some idea of what you want to do, some plan, some strategy, and work towards accomplishing that, and stick with it. These things are all very important, especially utilizing the ideas of weakening your opponent's pawns and strengthening your own, and also weakening squares and strengthening your own squares. You know, one of the beauties of chess is that there are so many possibilities in it. Positions are always filled with different types of resources. Some of them aren't always good for you, but some are. I'd like to show you a very interesting position. You know, when someone is attacking you and you think you're lost, but just about ready to give it all up. But if you understand the weaknesses in your opponent's position and the strengths in your own, you could quite possibly find something. Like in this position here, white plays, queen takes pawn check. Now black can move this rook here and trap the queen. The queen doesn't have anywhere to go. And that looks pretty hopeless because there aren't many pieces on the board and it doesn't look like there's much in the position. But yet there is. Because if you look hard enough, and you always have to look at moves that have some force and effect to them, like rook takes pawn, attacking the queen. What happens if queen takes rook? These are things you have to think about in your mind. What can you do? Does it change things? Well, let's see. It does in this position because the queen now does not guard this square. And not only does it let the queen out, but it allows a checkmate. So that's quite a turnaround from having your queen trapped in one move to checkmating your opponent in the next. But you have to think, you have to understand what squares are weak and what the basic idea, what you're trying to do. Let's take a look at that position again. Looks pretty bad. You see, so the only move here after this is rook takes queen. And rook takes queen. And who knows what would be good for black here, but it's very obvious that white has a far superior position. First of all, he's a pawn up, and these pawns are isolated and will fall easily. In rook-pawn endings, as you know, it's very important, if you can, to control the 7th rank. In this particular position, that would rather be hard to do since both rooks are occupying it, but you'd have to try to defend your own 7th rank and just attack and pick off these pawns and get your king into the center and centralize it. Checks in a rook-pawn ending, as we've told you before, are not always that effective unless they're checks that lead to the win of material or possibly a mate. Well, this is our 15th program, and if you've been following us closely all along, you will have learned most of the basic principles of chess, such as controlling the center, what an open file is in a rank, how to develop your pieces properly and quickly, what a tempo is, and how to utilize some of these things, as we've seen in some of our problems and games that we've shown you. And of course, one of the most important things is to think ahead, to develop the ability to think and visualize positions that will occur in the future. And to give us his views on these very things, next week we'll have with us the Canadian champion, Peter Biasis. Until then, good night.